The snow was falling in slow, drifting sheets when I pulled my car up to the curb outside my parents' house in Oak Park. The kind of snow that glows under the streetlights and makes the whole neighborhood look peaceful, even when you know it is not. I sat there for a moment, with the engine still humming and my hands resting on the steering wheel. I could hear faint laughter from inside the house, that bright, holiday kind of laughter that always made me feel like an outsider. It is strange how you can be grown, pay your own bills, build your own life, and still feel 12 years old again when you pull up to the home you grew up in. I remember thinking, if anyone were listening to this someday, I would want to ask them what they were doing at that moment. Cook dinner, knitting a scarf, folding laundry, or maybe driving home from work. For me, on the night all of this happened, I was sitting in my car watching the snow fall and gathering enough breath to walk through that front door. That is when I realized I should probably ask you to like or subscribe if you enjoy stories where the quiet one finally learns to speak. It helps more than you know. Then I took my keys from the ignition, held them for a second, and stepped out into the cold. Inside the house, everything was warm and bright. My dad had covered the place in colored lights that blinked red and green along the banisters. The smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and something overly sweet filled the air. My mom liked to bake those little pecan tarts every Christmas Eve. I used to love them. But the smell now felt like something from a life that never truly belonged to me. Jessica was the first to see me. She sat at the dining table with her elbows propped up, her diamond ring catching the light on purpose. She tossed her blonde hair to one side and gave me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Daniel sat beside her in one of his tailored suits. He always overdressed for family dinners, as if he wanted to remind everyone he believed he had outgrown the room. My parents were across from them, leaning close and whispering, the way people do when they have already established who is worth their attention and who is not. My mom said, "Oh, Emily, you made it," as if she had not been sure I would. My dad looked up only long enough to nod. I hung my coat on the rack and tried to ignore the familiar weight settling in my chest. We sat down at the table. I slipped into my usual seat at the far end, the seat where I was least visible. Conversation flowed around me the way a river flows around a rock. Jessica talked about Daniel's new project, some development he expected to secure a contract for through City Hall in the coming weeks. My parents nodded as if he were describing a discovery that would cure every disease known to man. I sat quietly, my hands in my lap, listening. Then it began. It always begins the same way. My dad cleared his throat and held up his glass. "To my family," he said. And then he turned toward me with a smile that felt like a blade. "And to Emily for showing up. We know times must be hard. It takes real courage to walk into a house full of people who are not living off welfare." The table erupted in laughter. Even my mom smiled behind her napkin, like she did not want to be rude, but simply could not help agreeing. I felt my cheeks burn, but I did not say a word. I had learned a long time ago that speaking only made things worse. Jessica leaned toward me, her voice bright and cruel. "Keep living like that, Emily. You will never marry a man like mine." She touched Daniel's arm, and he gave me a look that was somewhere between pity and smug satisfaction. My dad took another sip of wine and said, "It is a good thing we have Jessica to carry the family forward. She has always had direction, unlike some people who float from thing to thing without ever landing." My mom nodded and reached into her purse. She pulled out a thin stack of papers clipped together. Her voice went soft and sugary. "Honey, we need you to sign something. Just some estate paperwork from your grandfather. He left a small portion to both you girls, but since you do not have the same responsibilities as Jessica, it makes sense for her to receive it all. You understand. You always were the practical one." She slid the papers toward me. I scanned the first page. A legal form that would remove me from the inheritance entirely. My grandfather, Samuel Grayson, was the only person in that family who ever believed in me. The only one who never made me feel small. And they wanted to erase even that. The room waited. They always waited for me to take the smallest piece, the smallest seat, the smallest life. Waiting for me to accept whatever role they had assigned. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, but I kept my face calm. I sat there another second, letting the moment settle, letting their confidence sit heavily between us. They expected compliance, because that was all I had ever given them. Then I reached into my purse. My hands felt steady in a way I had not expected. I slid the white envelope onto the table and watched as it glided across the polished wood, stopping right in front of my sister. Her eyes narrowed. My mom leaned forward. My dad raised an eyebrow. Nobody touched it. For a long breath, the house went silent. The blinking lights on the tree reflected in the window behind them. I could hear the faint hum of the heater and the clatter of a dish in the kitchen. The whole room felt suspended in the air. I stood up slowly and reached for my coat. My chair scraped the floor. My sister frowned. My mom's lips parted as if she might object. My dad watched me with confusion that bordered on irritation. I did not give them a single explanation. Not one word. My coat slid onto my shoulders, warm from hanging near the vent. I walked toward the front door. Behind me, I heard Margaret say to Emily, "What is in that envelope?" But I did not answer. I opened the door and stepped into the cold night. Snow brushed against my face. The sound of the door closing muffled the chaos behind me. I walked to my car as quietly as I could, the air sharp in my lungs, my footsteps soft on the fresh powder. For the first time in years, I felt steady inside my own skin. When I pulled the car door open and sat down, I looked back at the house for a moment. The windows glowed with warm yellow light. Somewhere in that dining room, the envelope was waiting, and so was the truth they had never imagined. I turned the key, and the engine started with a low rumble. The snow was falling heavier now, and the world outside my windshield looked soft and quiet. I pulled away from the curb and began driving toward Chicago, away from the only place that had ever made me feel small. At that moment, I did not know what they were doing inside the house. I only knew I had finally walked away, and that was the first time I felt a spark of freedom. When I drove away from Oak Park, the snow kept falling in soft waves across, the windshield catching the light from the passing street lamps and scattering it across the glass like glitter. The quiet inside the car felt different than the quiet inside that house. This one felt open. It felt like breathing after being held underwater. I drove for a while without turning on the radio. The only sound was the steady hum of the tires as they moved along the slick pavement. My hands were wrapped around the steering wheel, warm from the heater, and for the first time in a long time, they were not trembling. The further I got from my parents' house, the lighter my chest felt. It was not joy, not yet. It was something like relief mixed with disbelief. I kept replaying the moment the envelope slid across the table, the way every face stiffened for just a second, the way the room froze as if the air had been sucked out. I wondered how long it would take before they opened it, before they understood what it meant, before the little world they had built on top of my back shifted in ways they never expected. I reached the interstate and merged into the slower lane where the road had been plowed. The city skyline was a faint blur in the distance, soft behind the drifting snow. Chicago always looked beautiful at night in winter. I used to stare at the skyline from my tiny apartment years ago and imagine building something of my own within those glowing towers. Something with purpose, something that mattered, something no one in my family would ever try to take from me, because they would never care enough to notice. The drive gave me space to think, something I rarely had at those family gatherings. I let myself drift back through the years, not in a painful way, but in the way you replay an old movie you finally understand. I saw myself at 12 years old, sitting in the back seat while Jessica sat, shotgun because she was younger, and cried if she did not get her way. I saw myself at 16 being told that Jessica needed the family car for her modeling classes, even though I had a job interview across town. I remembered my mom saying it in her sweet half-whisper that always meant she had already chosen sides. "Baby, you are more independent. Jessica needs a little more help." I remembered my dad telling relatives that Jessica was the one who would go far, that she had drive, that she had ambition. They never said it to hurt me. They said it because they believed it was true, and because they believed the opposite about me. I was the steady one, the practical one, the one who should not expect too much, But my grandfather, Samuel Grayson, never treated me that way. The memory of him came to me as I crossed the bridge into downtown Chicago. I could still hear his calm voice telling me that kindness was not weakness, and that working with empathy did not make a person small. He gave me books on civic work and told me stories about the families he taught during his years as a public school teacher. He said that the world always found a way to reward people who tried to make it better. I clung to those words more times than I could count. When he passed in the spring of 2019, it broke something in me that had not healed for a long time. But even then, I believed he had left a part of himself to guide me. The fact that he had split his inheritance evenly between Jessica and me felt like the last confirmation that he saw me clearly. And the fact that my parents wanted me to sign away his final gift tonight filled me with a sadness deeper than anger. I reached my office building in downtown Chicago and turned into the small parking lot behind it. The security lights cast long shadows across the snow, and the footprints from the last person who left had already begun to fill in. My nonprofit had grown more than I ever expected. When I founded it in 2017, I thought it would be a small, community project. Just me, a few volunteers, and a mission to help people who felt invisible the way I had often felt invisible. But over the years, it became something bigger. We developed programs for housing support, food assistance, legal aid, and emergency relief. We helped thousands of families in neighborhoods the city rarely paid attention to. I stepped out of the car and breathed in the cold night air. It felt sharp and clean. The building stood tall and quiet, its windows dark, except for the light I knew was on in my office upstairs. I had left it on earlier that morning because I planned to come back after the family dinner. It was the one place where my thoughts felt grounded. Inside the lobby, everything was cold and still. My boots echoed softly against the tile floor as I walked toward the staircase. The familiar smell of old carpet and printer toner comforted me in a strange way. I climbed the stairs slowly, letting the heaviness of the night settle behind me instead of inside me. My office door creaked a little when I pushed it open. The small lamp on my desk cast a warm glow over the stacks of folders and files. I set my purse on the chair and unbuttoned my coat. The quiet felt like a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. For a while, I did not move. I just stood there, letting the silence fill me. Eventually, I walked to the window and looked out at the city. Snowflakes drifted past the glass, one by one. The lights from the surrounding buildings flickered as if the whole skyline were breathing. I thought about the envelope again and what it meant. Inside that envelope was the truth about a life they never cared to ask about, a life they assumed was small, a life they believed depended on welfare, a life they dismissed. I touched my fingers lightly against the window and watched the snow fall. My phone was still in my coat pocket, turned off since I walked out of the house. I did not want to hear anything from them. Not yet. Not tonight. A quiet memory rose to the surface. The night I first decided to start this nonprofit, I had been standing on this same street, watching a family huddle together on a bus stop bench. A mom with 2 children wrapped in blankets that were far too thin for the Chicago winter. I remember the sound of the traffic and the distant sirens, and the way the mom kept wiping her child's nose with her sleeve because she had nothing else. That image stayed with me. It was the kind of moment that marks you in a permanent way. I turned back toward my desk and sat down. I rubbed my hands together and leaned back in the chair. I felt the exhaustion from the night settle into my bones, but under it was something steadier. Something like clarity. Tonight, I had shaken something loose. I could feel it. I had walked out of that house without giving them the reaction they expected. And that meant the next step was unfolding whether I was ready or not. The lamp flickered slightly, and I reached over to steady the cord. In the quiet, in the calm rhythm of the heater turning on, I realized something simple but profound. For the first time in years, I was not scared of what came next. I let myself sink into that feeling as the snow outside continued to fall, and for a long moment, I simply breathed. Then I pushed myself up from the chair, switched off the small lamp on my desk, and walked toward the hallway where the motion lights flicked on one by one. The soft hum of electricity echoed in the empty building. It felt almost like the place was breathing with me. I walked slowly through the corridors of the nonprofit that had shaped the last several years of my life. The halls were lined with photos from events, volunteers hugging clients, children smiling with winter jackets we had helped provide, families holding grocery boxes filled with things they could not afford during the holidays. Each picture reminded me why I had built this place and why I fought so hard for it. I stopped at the framed newspaper clipping near the main conference room. It was from a community paper that had featured us in 2021, when our food program expanded citywide. The headline was simple and warm. A small organization makes a big impact in Chicago. My parents never read it. I had emailed it to them, and my dad responded with a vague, "good job." My mom said she was proud of me in the same tone she used when Jessica finished a puzzle as a child. They saw it as a hobby. They never saw the weight of what we handled every day. I walked into the main hall where we held our weekly meetings. The chairs were stacked neatly in the corner, and the whiteboard still had notes from our last staff huddle. Words like outreach and shelter count were circled in blue marker. Someone had doodled a small house in the corner, probably Jonah from the housing team. He had a habit of sketching little cartoons while he listened. I smiled at the memory. Walking further into the building, I reached the large storage room where we kept donations. The faint smell of cardboard and fresh detergent filled the air. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with diapers, winter coats, canned goods, and emergency toiletries. Everything is neatly labeled. Everything is color-coded. Everything is a reminder that our clients depended on us to survive the harsh edges of the city. I ran my hand along a shelf where we kept baby formula. I thought about the young mom we helped last winter who had been living in her car with a toddler. She had come in shaking with cold, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me she felt like a failure. I remembered telling her that needing help did not make her small. It made her human. She cried in my arms for several minutes. That moment stayed with me and guided many of my decisions afterward. I sat down on a folding chair near the storage tables and listened to the faint rumble of traffic outside. My body was tired, but my mind kept drifting. It drifted to my grandfather again, and the nights he spent helping me with my schoolwork at his kitchen table. I remembered the little hum he made when he concentrated. He used to tell me that a good heart was a kind of brilliance, and that the world needed more people who were unafraid to care deeply. If he had been alive tonight, he would have told me that walking out of that house was not disrespectful. It was self-respect. He would have told me that people who love you do not shrink you, and people who refuse to see your light will always demand that you dim it for their comfort. My phone stayed off. I was not ready for whatever messages might be waiting. I imagined the scene unfolding back in Oak Park, my family staring at the envelope, wondering what I had slipped across the table. I wondered if Jessica had opened it yet. If she would Chicago. She would know that I was not drifting or lost or living off anything. She would see the proof of who I had become. The idea brought a strange mix of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness, because I had once wished they would celebrate my victories. Satisfaction, because I no longer needed their applause. I stood up and began walking again, letting my feet guide me through the building. My steps carried me to the second floor, to the office we used for legal aid intakes. The desk lamp was off, but the pile of folders on the table caught my attention. They were arranged neatly, each with a different story inside. A woman escaping domestic violence. A man wrongfully evicted. A single father fighting to regain custody of his children. These were the people who knew my worth. They knew the impact of my work far better than my own family ever had. I touched one of the folders lightly and let my fingers rest there. In the quiet, I understood something about myself that I had resisted for years. I had built a life that mattered. A life with meaning. A life with impact. And none of it had ever come from being accepted by my parents or compared. With Jessica, every meaningful moment had come from the people who walked through our doors, looking for hope. As I walked toward my office again, I heard the faint buzz of the building's heating system kicking back on. The sound was comforting, like a low, steady heartbeat. I returned to the window and sat on the edge of the desk, watching snow continue to drift down in calm, white sheets. For a moment, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I pictured my grandfather sitting beside me, his presence warm and steady. He would have smiled at me tonight. He would have told me that choosing myself was the bravest thing I had ever done. I opened my eyes and looked out at the city lights. They flickered like tiny fires against the dark sky. I thought about my family inside that warm house, unaware that their night was about to unravel, unaware of the news alert that would soon cross their television, unaware of the collapse that was inching closer with every passing hour. My phone was still silent in my coat pocket. It was too early for the storm to reach me, but I could feel the air shifting, the way you can sense a change in weather before the clouds appear. I turned back toward the room, letting the dim light settle around me as the snow continued falling beyond the window. In the stillness, I felt something solid return to my chest. Something like strength. Something like direction. I knew that when my phone finally lit up, nothing would ever be the same again. But for the moment, the quiet inside the building wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I pushed myself away from the window and walked back toward my desk, feeling the familiar ache in my shoulders from the long day. I reached for my water bottle, took a slow sip, and then my eyes drifted toward the folder sitting on the corner of the desk. It was the same folder I had pushed aside earlier that afternoon, the one marked Morris Realty. And even though I was exhausted, something in me knew I was not done with it. I pulled the folder toward me and opened it. The pages inside were filled with documents that had bothered me from the first time I saw them. Forms that looked clean on the surface, but crooked around the edges. Numbers that were too perfect, too identical, in ways that did not happen in real life. Names that repeated across different addresses with only slight differences in spelling. Even without a finance degree, I could tell something was off. People who think they are smarter than everyone else often leave clues without realizing it. I lifted one of the intake forms and held it under the light. A woman's name was listed on a rental application, but the signature line looked almost handwritten by someone trying to mimic a cursive style that was not their own. Another page listed a family of 4 for a housing subsidy program that my nonprofit helped administer, except the ages of the children were scratched out and rewritten. The notes and the margins were vague. Just enough information to pass as legitimate, but not enough to survive a real review. I placed the papers down and leaned back in my chair. Daniel had bragged earlier that night about securing a major contract with City Hall. He had talked about it for months, describing in detail how it would catapult Morris Realty into a higher tier of work, credibility, and financial reward. My parents had eaten up every word, proud that their son-in-law was moving up in ways they believed I never could. But as I stared at those forms now, I knew that contract was hanging by a thread, and that thread was partly in my hands. I closed my eyes and let the memory of that afternoon rise. It had been a month ago. I was coming down the staircase in this very building when I heard voices, echoing from the legal intake room. I recognized Daniel's tone, that confident sales pitch he used whenever he wanted someone to believe he was doing them a favor. He was talking to a man whose voice trembled slightly with worry. Daniel was encouraging him to sign a document that did not match the man's situation. When the man hesitated, Daniel lowered his voice and said something about helping him bypass certain steps. The whole exchange had felt wrong. I'd stepped back into the hallway before they saw me, but that conversation stayed with me. That was the moment I began looking closer at the files connected to his company. That was when I called my attorney, David Brooks, and asked him to review the cases. And that was when David quietly reached out to the compliance office at City Hall to request a closer look at the pending contract. I opened my eyes again and stared at the papers. I felt a mixture of anger and disappointment, not because Daniel had broken rules or taken shortcuts, but because he did it on the backs of people who were already struggling. Using vulnerable families as stepping stones was a different kind of cruelty, a kind that burrowed deep and left real damage behind. The overhead light flickered slightly as the heater kicked on again. I stood and stretched my arms, walked around the desk, and let my fingertips glide along the back of the worn fabric chair. My reflection in the window caught my eye for a second. I looked tired, but not the kind of tired that comes from defeat. It was the kind of tiredness that comes from holding your ground. My footsteps carried me down the hallway toward the conference room again, almost as if I needed the comfort of open space. I sat at the table, leaned forward, and let my forehead rest against my folded hands for a moment. The way it rested on the table before I walked out. The white paper sitting in a room full of people who had never seen me as anything but a disappointment. Inside that envelope was not a message or confession, It was a wedding invitation printed on thick cardstock with gold lettering. It announced the mayor of Chicago. It represented a truth they refused to imagine, a truth they would have mocked had I said it aloud. I knew that when they opened it, everything they believed about me would begin to fracture. I sat back and let my head fall against the chair. My eyes followed the slight cracks in the ceiling paint. I thought about Michael and the way he had looked at me the night we met at a community awards event. He had approached me gently, asked questions about my work, listened with genuine interest instead of condescension. He had stood at the edge of the room waiting for me to finish a conversation with a family in need, never once acting impatiently. That night, I realized he saw me the way my grandfather once had. He saw the value beneath the surface. He saw the worth I carried. My phone vibrated suddenly from inside my coat pocket. The vibration was soft, but sharp enough to make my heart thump. I reached for the coat draped across the chair, slipped my hand into the pocket, and pulled out the phone. The screen stayed black. It was just a small shift inside the lining of the coat that had triggered the motion. I let out a long breath. The storm had not reached me yet. I stood again and walked slowly toward the window at the far end of the room. Snow continued falling in steady streaks, thicker now, coating the streets in white. Cars moved slowly, leaving deep tracks behind them. The city looked peaceful, despite everything that was unraveling beneath its surface. I rested my palm against the cold glass. I did not wish for revenge. I wished for peace, but sometimes peace requires a truth that shakes the foundation of everything around it. The first cracks in that foundation were already forming, and I could feel them even as I stood there with my palm pressed lightly against the cold window. Something inside me shifted, urging me to move, to leave the quiet of the office and breathe air that was not filled with memories or paperwork or the weight of what had just happened. My legs carried me toward my coat automatically, as if they knew I needed to step outside for a moment and feel the night on my skin. I slipped on my coat, wrapped my scarf around my neck, and walked down the hallway toward the stairs. The lights dimmed behind me. When I stepped outside, the cold rushed up to meet me. It was a clean cold, the kind that bites at your cheeks but clears your head. The snow was lighter now, drifting softly like feathers shaken loose from a giant pillow. My breath came out in small clouds as I walked toward the street. There was a small cafe across from the building, the kind with old brick walls and 2 little lamps in the windows. It stayed open late for hospital workers and night shift employees. I crossed the quiet street and pushed open the door. A bell chimed overhead. The familiar smell of coffee and baked bread greeted me like a friend. There were only a few people inside. A man with a newspaper, a young college student typing on a laptop, and in the far corner, near the window, sat Clara. She looked up as soon as I walked in, her eyes warming the way they always did. Clara had one of those faces that carried kindness even in silence. She waved me over, and I walked to the table, brushing snowflakes from my shoulders. "You look like you have been through a storm," she said softly as I sat down. I smiled faintly. "Something like that." Clara sipped her tea and studied my face. "You did it, did you not? You finally walked out of that house." I nodded. I could feel the weight of the night settling again, but her presence made it easier to hold. Clara had once walked into our nonprofit on a freezing morning with no gloves, her hands raw and red from the cold. She had just lost her job and her housing at the same time. I remembered sitting with her for an hour, listening to her story, connecting her with resources, and promising her that she was not alone. Now she sat here across from me, steady and warm, returning something I had once given her. "I left them mid-dinner," I said, and I did not say a single word. Clara leaned back slightly. That silence probably spoke louder than anything you could have said. I let out a short breath that felt like part laugh, part disbelief. They told me to sign away my inheritance. From my grandfather. They wanted Jessica to have everything. Clara's expression softened. People who rely on control always want more. They think affection is a currency they can bargain with. I looked down at the table and traced my finger along a small scratch in the wood. I should have known they would try it. My mom had that tone in her voice, that soft tone she uses when she thinks she is being gentle while pushing me into something. Clara nodded slowly. And your sister. She never hides how she feels. No, she does not. She made it clear I would never be on her level, married to a man like Daniel, living the life they all admire. Clara leaned forward. You do know they built their whole idea of success around image, not substance. I nodded again, letting her words settle. The waitress came by and placed a cup of hot tea in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it, grateful for the warmth. Clara rested her hands around her own mug. You know, she said after a moment, I once tried to thank your family. Back when things turned around for me, I told them I wanted to express gratitude for what your nonprofit had done. A small knot tightened in my stomach. I did not know that. Clara offered a faint smile. Your mom looked at me like I was interrupting something important. Your dad barely looked up from his phone. They asked if I was from church or selling something. That sounded painfully familiar. I lowered my gaze and let the steam from the tea brush my face. Clara spoke gently. They are not bad people, Emily, but they do not see you. They only see what they want to see. Some families build their realities like stage sets, and anything that does not match the backdrop gets pushed out of view. Her words hit something deep inside me, something that had been sitting there for years, like a bruise that never fully healed. I felt myself swallow. I spent so long trying to fit into their version of me. Clara shook her head. You do not have to shrink anymore. You know that, right? I nodded, but said nothing. The warmth from the tea seeped into my hands and eased some of the tension in my chest. Clara reached across the table and touched my wrist lightly. You think walking away makes you cold or selfish, but sometimes walking away is how you protect the parts of you that they never bothered to understand. I looked up, meeting her eyes. There was no judgment there, just kindness and understanding. She continued, You built a life full of meaning. You help people every single day. You built something your grandfather would be proud of, and they have no idea who you are because they never bothered to ask. A breath escaped me, shaky but grounding. She was right. I had spent years sinking into the shadows of their expectations, but in Chicago, in these halls, and in the lives of the people we served, I was not invisible. I was not lesser. I was not the failure they believed I was. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but not from sadness, from relief, from finally hearing words I had needed for so long. Clara squeezed my wrist once more. Do not let them rewrite your story, Emily. You have already lived enough pages to know who you are. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. I let the quiet stretch between us while I caught my breath. Outside, snow continued falling, setting on the sidewalks and rooftops in soft, white layers. The world looked peaceful, untouched, like a clean slate waiting for someone to step into it. When I finally stood to leave, the tea was half gone, and the tension in my shoulders had eased. Clara stood with me and wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck. Take care of yourself, she said gently. And remember, sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is strength. I stepped out of the cafe and into the cold night air. The snow had stopped, leaving the streets shining under the streetlights. As I crossed back toward my building, I felt steadier than I had an hour earlier. Clara's words lingered with me, warm against the chill in the air. I walked toward the entrance, my boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. The night felt quiet again, but this time the quiet did not feel heavy. It felt full, like something was preparing to unfold. I reached the door, pulled it open, and stepped inside the building where my real life waited. And in that moment, I felt ready for whatever would come next. I stepped inside the building where my real life waited, and for a moment, I just stood there in the dim glow of the lobby lights. The air inside was warmer than the street, but still cool enough to keep me awake. My boots left small wet marks on the tile floor as I walked toward the staircase. Each step echoed softly in the quiet. By the time I reached the landing of the second floor, I could feel the shift inside me again. The one that had been building since I left Oak Park. A kind of steady certainty, a quiet strength that felt new and familiar at the same time. I reached my office and pushed the door open. The faint smell of paper and winter air lingered in the room. I flipped on the small lamp on my desk and slid off my coat, laying it gently across the chair. I walked to the window, watching the streetlights cast long shadows on the snow-covered pavement. Chicago looked peaceful tonight, like the city was holding its breath. My phone was still off. I did not want to break the calm yet. Instead, I sat down at my desk and pulled the laptop closer. I opened my email, knowing there were things waiting that I needed to see. At the top of the inbox sat the message from City Hall with the subject line that had flickered through my thoughts all night. Confidential update. I clicked it open. The email was brief. A final review of Morris Realty had been completed. The city's compliance team had concerns about documentation connected to several properties. They planned to hold a meeting early next week and had thanked my organization for providing community data that helped identify irregularities. Nothing in the email mentioned Daniel by name, but the truth was clear. The contract he bragged about was now under serious scrutiny, and it had nothing to do with me interfering. It was simply the reality of catching up with him. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. It was strange how quiet justice could feel. There was no thunderous crash, no dramatic music, just a slow, steady awareness that the ground beneath someone was about to shift. I stood and walked to the bookshelf, letting my fingers run along the row of binders and reports. My hand stopped on the binder labeled Housing Records 2024. I pulled it out and placed it on the desk. As I opened it, I felt the familiar rhythm of work settle into me. Numbers, forms, signatures. They all told stories. And lately, the stories had pointed in one direction. I flipped through a section marked Winter Intakes. One page held my attention. A family listed as living at a rental property owned by Morris Realty. The address was familiar. I remembered driving past it months ago. The building looked abandoned, windows boarded up, paint peeling. Yet the form claimed a family of 5 lived there and received assistance. I traced the name signed at the bottom. It matched 2 other forms, same handwriting, slightly slanted, not the signature of someone who lived in unstable housing, more like someone trying to move fast, hoping no one would look closely. I set the binder aside and rubbed my temples. There was a heaviness in my chest. Not from fear, but from frustration. People like Daniel used the system not because they needed to, but because they believed they were untouchable. They preyed on the gaps in bureaucracy. They relied on people like my family, who worshipped outward success and never questioned how that success was built. A faint buzz from the hallway interrupted my thoughts. I stood and stepped outside. The building lights had dimmed more than usual. The nighttime setting had kicked in. The quiet felt deeper now. I walked down the hallway toward the main conference room, my steps slow and steady. Inside, the long table sat in the center of the room, the chairs neatly aligned. Papers from earlier projects lay in a small stack near the far end. I picked up one of the papers and scanned it. A progress report on the homeless outreach program we expanded last summer. It detailed the number of tents cleared safely, the assistance given, and the families moved into temporary shelters. My staff had poured heart and time into that initiative. They believed in the work the way I did. They believed in helping people with dignity. I sat down in one of the chairs and let my eyes drift around the room. I could almost see the laughter of staff meetings, the debates over budget, the moments of relief when we secured grants. Every corner of this building held memories that strengthened me in ways my childhood home never could. My thoughts drifted to Michael. I pictured the way he looked when he talked about the city, the way he spoke of people like they were stories worth hearing instead of statistics. He had always believed in community leadership and transparency. That was one of the reasons he connected with my organization so strongly. He understood the importance of truth in public service. Meeting him had been a turning point. I remembered the night at the awards ceremony when he shook my hand and told me he admired the work we did. His eyes were steady, warm, not sizing me up or evaluating me the way others often did. When he asked if we could talk more, his tone carried the sincerity of someone who saw beyond titles. Knowing he was now a major part of my life was still surreal at times, and knowing my family had no idea about him gave me a complicated mix of amusement and sadness. I stood up again and walked toward the windows of the conference room. Snowflakes hit the glass softly, melting into small trails of water that drifted downward. The street below was quiet, the way Chicago sometimes felt late at night during a heavy winter. I felt safe in that stillness, grounded. The truth was, I had been preparing for this moment in small ways for years. Saving myself piece by piece. Building a life they could not diminish. Invest in work that gave me purpose. Surrounding myself with people who lifted instead of tearing down. Walking out of that house tonight had been the final step in a journey I did not even realize I had been taking. I walked back to my office and sat down again. My eyes drifted to the envelope I had placed in the drawer earlier, the second copy of my wedding invitation. I picked it up and ran my fingers over the raised lettering. Emily Carter and Michael Thompson. Even seeing it written felt surreal, but also right. A quiet smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. I thought of the chaos that envelope must have caused back in Oak Park. Jessica's shock, my mom's confusion, my dad's anger, Daniel's panic. The thought might have felt petty in another moment, but tonight it simply felt like balance. Not revenge, just truth rising to the surface. I slipped the invitation back into the drawer, gently. The room felt warm again, steady. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Somewhere in the city, consequences were already forming. Decisions were being questioned. Contracts were being reviewed. And my family had no idea what was coming next. I whispered into the quiet room without intending to. Let it unfold. I stood, turned off the lamp, and walked back toward the hallway. The building felt like it was holding its breath again. I stopped at the top of the staircase, resting my hand on the railing as I looked down into the dimly lit lobby. The night was not over, and the storm had not fully reached me yet. I stopped at the top of the staircase, resting my hand on the railing as I looked down into the dimly lit lobby. The night was not over, and the storm had not fully reached me yet. I stood there a moment longer, then descended the stairs slowly, each step steady beneath my boots. The lobby felt almost sacred in its quiet. I pushed open the glass door and stepped back outside. The cold brushed against my cheeks again, sharper now, but welcome. I pulled my scarf closer and breathed in air that felt clean and honest. I walked toward my car, but instead of getting in, I leaned against the door, looking up at the heavy sky. Snowflakes drifted down lazily. My thoughts began to circle back to the moment at the dinner table, but not in the painful way I used to replay moments. It felt more like examining something from a distance, something that no longer held power over me. I could still see Jessica's smirk as she held her wine glass. I could hear my mom's voice, that mix of pity and superiority. I could picture my dad leaning back in his chair, confident he held the upper hand, and I could almost feel the weight of those estate papers sliding across the table toward me. Yet now, when I revisited that moment, the heat in my chest was gone. The sting had faded. What remained was clarity. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my gloves. As I slipped them on, I remembered the exact feeling that washed over me before I slid the envelope across the table. It was not anger, not fear, not even defiance. It was something quieter, something that felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of wading through mud. Inside that envelope sat the truth, a truth they never bothered to imagine. My engagement to Michael, my life in Chicago, my work, my worth. A part of me wondered whether my family would have been proud of me if they had known all of it earlier, whether they would have treated me differently. But another part of me knew the answer deep down. They would have found a way to diminish it, to twist it, to make it smaller than it was. I straightened from the car and began walking slowly along the sidewalk, letting my boots crunch softly through the thin layer of fresh snow. The streets were nearly empty. A few headlights glowed in the distance. A bus rumbled by, its windows fogged with warmth. Chicago at night felt almost like a friend who understood that sometimes. Silence was necessary. My breath created small clouds in the air. As I walked, I found myself remembering the exact second I let go of their expectations. Not tonight, but years earlier. I had been sitting at my grandfather's bedside in 2019, only hours before he passed. The room had been dim, the machines quiet, his hand warm in mine despite his weakening pulse. He had looked at me then with that familiar tenderness, the kind that wrapped itself around your heart. He whispered something that stayed with me ever since. You do not owe your life to anyone's small view of you. I carried those words with me into every hard decision I made afterward. They were with me when I submitted the paperwork to start the nonprofit, when I took my first leadership training, when I testified in front of the city council about housing safety, When Michael asked me out for coffee the first time, and they were with me tonight as I walked out of that house. I turned a corner and stopped in front of the large window pane of my building. The reflection staring back looked tired, but not defeated. A strand of hair fell out of my scarf and brushed my cheek, and I tucked it behind my ear absent-mindedly. My eyes drifted upward toward the second-floor window where I had stood earlier. The light was still on. For a moment, I pressed my fingertips against the cold glass. The building felt alive in its stillness. This place had seen my long nights, my small victories, my heartbreaks, and my triumphs. It had held my fears and my determination. It had held me back. I stepped back and looked up at the cloudy sky again. Then my thoughts shifted toward my family, not with longing or bitterness, but with acceptance. They would open that envelope. They would see the invitation. They would learn the truth. But the truth was not meant to hurt them. It was simply meant to exist. Whether they handled it gracefully or not was no longer my burden. I walked back into the building. The warm air greeted me again as I shut the door behind me. My footsteps echoed down the hall toward the staircase. I climbed the steps slowly, each one a steady thud beneath me. When I reached my office again, I flicked on the lamp. Its soft glow filled the room. I walked toward the window, but then hesitated. Instead, I reached for my chair and sat down, letting the cushion take my weight. For a moment, I let myself revisit the exact second at the dinner table, the sound of my chair scraping back, the hush that fell, the feel of the envelope leaving my fingertips. The cold air hit my face when I stepped outside. I allowed myself to linger on that memory, not to relive the pain, but to honor the courage it took. Walking out had felt like reclaiming something I had lost long ago, something I had not even realized was gone. My phone was still off. I traced a small circle on the desk with my fingertip. I did not want to think about the messages waiting. Not yet. They would come. The anger, the confusion, the accusations, perhaps even the desperation. But tonight, I was holding on to my peace. A soft buzz sounded through the vents as the heater kicked on again. The hum was steady and reassuring. I watched the steam from my breath fade slowly in the lamplight. Then I stood up again and walked to the window. The city below glowed quietly. Snowflakes drifted slower now, as if the sky were tired. I rested my forehead lightly against the cold glass. For a moment, I let myself feel the weight of everything. The grief, the relief, the fear, the strength, all tangled together in a way that made sense only to me. Then something inside me settled. It was not over. Not even close. But the hardest part had already passed. I stepped away from the window and turned back toward my desk. And that was when I knew the storm was about to reach me. I knew the storm was about to reach me, but I did not expect how quickly it would break open. I stood there in my office, the soft glow of the lamp warming the shadows. When the quiet seemed to shift, it was subtle, like the air tightening around me, as if the building itself sensed something I could not yet see. I walked slowly toward my desk, pressing my fingertips lightly along the edge as I moved. My body felt restless, and my thoughts flicked back and forth between the present and the image of my family sitting around that dinner table, staring at the envelope I had left behind. I sat down, leaned back in my chair, and tried to steady my breath. But something pulled my attention toward the silence itself. It felt charged, brittle. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the heater settle me. Then the quiet shifted again, and this time, I knew the storm had begun. It started in Oak Park. At that exact moment, while I was sitting in my office with the snow falling behind the window, my family was gathered in the dining room, staring at the envelope that sat untouched on the table. In my mind, I could see them clearly, almost as if I were standing in the corner, watching. Jessica would reach for it first. She always did. Always touched things that were not hers, as if the whole world belonged to her. She would pick up the envelope between two manicured fingers, shake it slightly, trying to guess what was inside. I imagined her lips curling into a smirk as she said something sharp and unnecessary, probably directed at my absence. Then she would tear it open. And the room, the entire house, the atmosphere they had built for decades, would fracture. I opened my eyes and pulled in a slow breath. Even without being there, I felt the shift, like a ripple moving outward across a lake. I stood and walked back to the window. The city outside was still and peaceful, a sharp contrast to what must have been unfolding across town. Snowflakes drifted down in scattered patterns, landing on the dark pavement and melting into tiny silver droplets. Cars moved slowly along the street. A siren wailed far in the distance, faint and fading. Then I pictured it clearly. Jessica pulled out the wedding invitation, her eyes widening, her breath catching. The gold lettering reflects off the dining room light. My name beside Michael's, the date, the location, the title beneath his name, Mayor of Chicago. My mom would gasp, one hand flying to her chest. My dad would sit up straighter, disbelief washing over his face like a splash of cold water. Daniel would go pale, truly pale. Because Michael was not just the mayor. He was the man whose administration and compliance team had already raised questions about Morris Realty's integrity. The room would turn quiet in a way my childhood home never knew how to be. Not peaceful quiet, not gentle quiet, but sharp, tense, breathless quiet. The kind that arrives right before the truth forces its way into a place that has resisted it for far too long. I rested my forehead lightly against the glass, letting the cold seep into my skin. A strange mix of sadness and relief washed over me. Sadness because I had once wanted their acceptance. Ray, because now I knew I had finally stopped chasing it. Somewhere in Oak Park, my mom would be asking, "Why did she not tell us?" And my dad would be pretending that he was not blindsided, pretending he had expected something like this all along. Jessica would be flipping through the invitation as if reading it again might change the print. And Daniel would be staring at the floor, calculating what this meant for him. A contract with City Hall, his reputation, his image. And then came the part I could picture perfectly. Someone would turn on the television. Maybe Jessica, needing distraction. Maybe my dad, needing noise. Maybe it would simply already be on, and the news alert would appear. Morris Realty under investigation for documentation irregularities. City Hall reviewing contract approval. Potential violations under review. I closed my eyes again, feeling that moment in my chest, as if I were standing beside them. The entire room would shift from shock to panic. My dad would demand answers. My mom would wring her hands. Jessica would turn on Daniel with a fury she usually saved for me. And Daniel, who spent years bathing in his own confidence, would feel the first cracks forming under his feet. I imagined the sound of chairs scraping backward, the hurried footsteps, the rising voices, the collision of blame and fear thickening the air. And eventually, someone would shout my name, as if I had orchestrated everything. As if truth needed my help to show itself. I stepped back from the window slowly and returned to my desk. Instead of sitting, I hovered there, letting the moment settle. I did not take pleasure in imagining their panic. I did not enjoy the idea of them stunned or confused. The feeling inside me was not triumph, but something deeper, something calmer. It was the peace that comes from release. My phone was still off. I reached for it, but did not turn it on. I held it in my hand for a long moment, feeling its weight. It reminded me of the way grief feels sometimes. Small, but heavy, resting in your palm while you decide what to do with it. I set the phone down and walked toward the hallway again. My body felt restless, as if movement would help me hold all the emotions rising inside me. I walked down the stairs slowly. The lobby lights gave everything a warm, amber glow. I walked across the tile floor, past the row of chairs where clients sometimes waited during the day, past the bulletin board filled with flyers for community resources. When I reached the front door, I stopped. I stood there, looking out at the quiet street again. Snowflakes floated lazily in the air. A streetcar hummed past the intersection. The wind made the street lights sway gently. Everything looked peaceful, untouched, like the world itself was pausing. It felt strange when away, while here, everything remained still. But life has always had a way of dividing itself like that. One place burning, another place is calm. My fingers brushed the door handle, but I did not push it open. Instead, I let my hand fall back to my side. Something inside me whispered, "Wait." So I did. I turned away from the door and walked back into the quiet of the building. My footsteps echoed faintly behind me. I moved toward the center of the lobby and let myself stand in the stillness. The storm had begun, and it was moving closer. I walked back toward the center of the lobby, the quiet settling around me in a way that felt almost thick. That was when the storm truly reached me. It did not come as a sound at first. It came as a feeling, a faint vibration against the floor, like footsteps running in a house miles away. Then another. Then a rush of something sharp and urgent inside my chest. I stood perfectly still for a moment, letting the quiet shift around me, until the first real sound finally cut through. My phone upstairs began vibrating non-stop. I froze. It was faint from the top floor, but unmistakable. A steady buzz, like a trapped insect against the inside of a jar. Then it stopped. Then it started again. Longer this time, like someone was calling back immediately after being ignored. My heartbeat quickened, not in fear, but in recognition. They had opened the envelope. I turned toward the staircase and walked up quickly, my boots thudding against the steps. Halfway up, another vibration echoed from my office, pulsing through the walls. By the time I reached my door, the buzzing had become constant. I stepped inside and saw my phone lighting up repeatedly across the desk, the screen flashing with a flood of missed call notifications that blinked, faster than I could count. I walked over slowly and picked up the phone, feeling its warmth from the non-stop activity. I kept it in my hand, but I did not turn it on yet. Instead, I set it down gently, screen facing downward, and sat in my chair. This was the moment the past finally collided with the truth. Outside, the snow kept falling in soft streaks under the streetlights. Inside, the buzzing stopped for a few seconds, then began again. I closed my eyes and imagined the scene unfolding in my childhood home. Jessica leaned over the table, holding the invitation with both hands like she was afraid of dropping it. My mom asked how I could possibly know the mayor. My dad demanded to know why I would not tell them. Daniel turned pale, because he knew exactly what the truth meant for him. Then the television in the background switched to a news segment, a reporter announcing a review of Morris Realty documentation, a mention of possible contract suspension. The house would have erupted. I opened my eyes again, and for a moment, I felt nothing but the sound of my own breath. The truth was settling into every corner of the world I had left behind, like snowfall covering a driveway overnight. My phone buzzed again. I finally reached for it and pressed the side button. The screen lit up. Missed calls filled the screen like a cascade. 3 dozen missed calls. 36 in total. One after another, from my dad, from my mom, from Jessica, from numbers I did not recognize, likely Daniel's coworkers, or someone from the family circle who suddenly decided they cared enough to reach out. Voice messages filled the list beneath each notification. I did not listen to a single one. I placed the phone face down again and leaned back, letting the chair support my weight. Somewhere inside me, a memory rose like a tide. I remembered being 10 years old, running through that same house, trying to show my mom a certificate I had won at school. I remembered her glancing at it for barely a second before saying she was busy, and handing the paper back without looking me in the eye. I remembered how my dad told me that achievements meant nothing unless they aligned with what he wanted for his children. For years, I had convinced myself that things would change as an adult, that if I just worked hard enough, or accomplished enough, or behaved well enough, they would finally see me. But tonight proved what I had known deep down for a long time. Some people do not see you until something forces them to. I stood again and walked toward the far window. The snow had thickened. Cars left deep shadows as they passed. I let my forehead rest against the glass, feeling the bite of the cold. My phone buzzed again behind me. My dad was probably saying that this was a misunderstanding. My mom was probably crying. Jessica likely oscillated between rage and confusion. Daniel would be panicking, calculating how fast he needed to act to salvage his reputation before it slipped through his fingers. And through all of that noise, all of that chaos, the truth sat in the center like a quiet flame. I had not done anything to humiliate them. I had not sought revenge. I had simply lived my life honestly, quietly, and with integrity. The envelope they opened did the rest. Not because it was designed to harm them, but because it revealed a contrast between who they thought I was and who I had become. a sharp contrast they never imagined. I lifted my head from the glass and exhaled a long breath. The heater hummed through the vents again, steady and warm. I turned and began walking around the office, letting my fingertips glide over the back of the chairs, along the top of the bookshelf, across the stack of intake folders. This building had held my story long before my family bothered to ask what I was doing with my life. My phone buzzed again. This time, I let the sound blend into the quiet. I walked toward the conference room one more time and stepped inside. The large table sat in the center like an anchor. I pulled out a chair and sat down, letting my gaze soften as I looked at the empty room. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, settling back into its normal rhythm. For the first time in years, I felt completely unafraid. The storm had reached me, and I was still standing. My phone buzzed again, but this time only once. Then silence settled again. I knew what would come next. They would keep calling. They would demand answers. They would insist they deserved explanations. But what they deserved and what they demanded were two entirely different things. I breathed in deeply, letting the warmth of the room fill the space inside me that had once been hollowed out by their judgment. Then I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. There was still more ahead, more truth, more unraveling, more conversations I knew I would eventually have to navigate. But for tonight, the world was balanced on a quiet edge. I turned toward the door, let my hand rest on the frame for a moment, then stepped back into the hallway, letting the warmth carry me forward as the snow continued falling. Beyond them, glass. I stepped back into my office and let the hush of the building settle into my skin. The storm outside had thinned into a soft drift, the snowflakes falling slowly, as if the sky itself was exhaling. I walked toward my desk and laid my hand on the chair, letting my fingers rest along the fabric. My phone was still dark, silent again, but I could feel the weight of every missed call and message lingering in there. The room like faint smoke that refused to rise. I pulled in a long breath and turned the phone face up. I pressed the button. The screen lit instantly. More missed calls, more messages. The number climbed past 40 now. I scrolled through the list without clicking anything. My dad, my mom, Jessica. Unknown numbers that were probably extended families who never cared until chaos touched their doorstep. I locked the screen and placed the phone down. Not everything needed a reply. I walked toward the window and looked out across the quiet street. The soft glow from the street lamps reflected against the snow, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Not a loud, triumphant kind of peace. A quiet one. The kind that settles in after you finally let go of what was never yours to carry. My phone buzzed lightly again. Only once. Then stopped. I did not reach for it. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. Then I finally walked back to the desk, sat down, and opened my laptop. I logged into the system and reviewed the email thread my attorney David had sent earlier. City Hall's compliance team had officially suspended the Morris Realty. Contract pending deeper investigation. The wording was clear. Serious discrepancies. Multiple red flags. Potential misuse of public resources. Daniel would not be able to talk or charm his way out of this. I closed the laptop and leaned back. I was not happy about the chaos he would face. But I was not sorry either. People who use vulnerable families as stepping stones eventually slip on the same stones they ignored. I stood again and walked toward the door, letting my fingertips trail along the wall. The moment I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed again in a short burst. I rolled my eyes softly and kept walking until I reached the end of the corridor. That was when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow. Familiar. Steady. Michael appeared at the top of the steps, brushing off snow from his coat. His eyes met mine with that quiet steadiness I had grown to trust. I walked toward him, and he reached out to touch my arm gently. "You made it through the longest night," he said in a soft tone. I smiled faintly. Did I? He nodded and helped me into my coat. His movements were gentle, not rushed, as if he knew my mind was still catching up with my emotions. We walked together down the staircase, each step a little easier than the last. When we reached the lobby, The heat from the vents warmed the air, and the world outside the glass doors glowed in soft winter light. My phone buzzed inside my pocket once more. I let it sit there. Michael looked at me with a mild curiosity, but he did not ask. He never asked more than I was ready to say. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. We stepped outside. The cold brushed my cheeks again, but it no longer felt sharp. It felt like something cleansing. Michael paused beside me. You know they will keep calling. They are scared, embarrassed, maybe both. I nodded. That is not my responsibility. He nodded back, a quiet gesture of understanding. Then he tucked his gloved hands into his pockets and walked with me down the sidewalk. The city around us was silent, wrapped in snow. After a few steps, I spoke. When I was younger, I thought if I did everything right, they would finally see me. Tonight I realized they never looked in my direction at all. Michael listened quietly. Then he said, "You saw yourself, though. That is what matters." His words landed softly. We kept walking. A car rolled past slowly, tires crunching against the snow. Someone across the street scraped a windshield with a long brush. A dog barked in the distance. Normal sounds. Comforting sounds. We reached his car. He opened the passenger door for me. But before I stepped inside, I looked up at the sky. The snowflakes were larger now, drifting slowly, each one catching the streetlight before melting against the air. I whispered quietly to myself. I did not break. I walked away. Then I got in and shut the door. As he drove, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen. A new voicemail from my mom. I let it fade into silence. Across town, news headlines would be spreading. My family would be scrambling to control damage they created themselves. Jessica would be calling anyone she could think of. Daniel's office would be filled with questions he would not know how to answer. My dad would pace the living room, blaming everyone but himself. My mom would try to appear calm, but internally unravel. Karma had arrived. Not from me. Not because I lashed out, but because truth does what it always does. It delivers itself. When we reached my apartment building, Michael walked me to the door. He kissed my forehead softly, squeezed my hand, and told me to rest. I watched him leave, and when his car disappeared around the corner, I turned toward the glass doors and walked inside. The building was quiet, warm, familiar. I took the elevator to my floor, unlocked my door, and stepped into the soft, dim light of my living room. I unwrapped my scarf, hung my coat, and stood in the center of the room, breathing in the warmth. This was my life now. My space, my peace, my future. Not borrowed, not questioned, not belittled. Mine. I walked to the window and looked out over the city. Snow drifted quietly across the skyline. I rested my palm against the glass. For the first time in years, I felt whole. I turned away from the window and let my voice settle into the quiet, speaking to the invisible room, to whoever needed to hear what I learned the hard way. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. I will stop here.